My name's Andrew Francis, and as we continue our Incarnational Ecclesiology, we're going to look at Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 16 to 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. We now come to one of the most horrible stories found in the Gospel. Anyone who has children of their own cannot help but feel deeply for the families impacted by the injustice of Herod's murderous ways. As Stanley Howes poignantly states, perhaps no event in the Gospel more determinatively challenges a sentimental depiction of Christmas than the death of these children. Jesus is born into a world in which children are killed and continue to be killed to protect the power of tyrants. The fact of Jesus' resurrection in no ways takes away from the pain of these deaths for parents or families, but it does make it possible not to lie about the world that has been redeemed. Whilst there are questions about the historicity of the slaughter of the children, there seems to be little question regarding Herod's potential to enact such a despicable murder. Whilst France recognises there is little evidence for this story, nonetheless he points out the lack of independent evidence is no more of a problem for this than for virtually every other incident recorded in the Gospels. I shall suggest that its magnitude should not be exaggerated. On the scale of atrocities known to have been perpetrated by Herod during his later years, this would register very low. As previously indicated, it would also seem apparent that yet again Matthew is drawing attention to a story that reminds the Jewish reader of the intended massacre of the Hebrew infants by Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 to 22. If Pharaoh had had his way, then even the baby Moses would have also been destroyed along with all the other male babies. Moses, of course, is also providentially saved from certain death and grows up to bring Israel out of their bondage in Egypt. Jesus, like Moses, was also saved from certain death to save his people once and for all. I also think that it is of significance that Matthew's Gospel presents Jesus as a legitimate heir to the throne of David in chapter 1, and then in chapter 2, verse 1, tells us that Jesus was born in the days of Herod the king. For all Herod's own messianic pretensions, his father was a Gentile of Idumean descent, and the historian Josephus claimed that Herod bribed Antony in Rome to have his political opponent Antigonus slain, and himself appointed Tetrarch of Galilee. And so we can see the juxtaposition being drawn by Matthew between the powerless true King Jesus and the powerful despot and false King Herod. Whilst the odds are decidedly in Herod's favour, still Jesus manages to survive. Excuse me. The quote from Jeremiah that Matthew uses to show yet again how the life of Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament is one of Matthew's most elusive Old Testament quotations, and few claim with any confidence to have fathomed what he intended. Nonetheless, just as Jeremiah spoke of the dead Rachel weeping over the Jewish people passing her tomb as they headed into exile, potentially Matthew might well have understood Rachel weeping over the death of Bethlehem's infants, with Rachel's tomb being located just outside of Bethlehem. It is worth noting that Jeremiah's prophecy concerning Rachel's weeping goes on to a note of hope and to the making of a new covenant. Moreover, as Matthew would have been aware, the Israelites did return from the exile, just as Jesus would also return from his exile in Egypt. In Jesus, God identifies with his people and their history. He relives, as it were, all that they have been through. He does so in such a way that he experiences a vulnerability that was also their experience, and yet does not attempt to draw back from such vulnerability. And so whilst I've already described something of the self-giving nature of God evidenced in the Trinity, along with the vulnerability of God expressed in the incarnation of Jesus, in developing an incarnational ecclesiology, I would further argue that the church, in truly seeking to be a Christ-like church, must always seek to clothe itself in vulnerability and intentionally resist the temptations to acquire wealth, political power, or military might. I've always found John Stott's explanation of the incarnation particularly helpful. If God sent a man to us, as he had sent the prophets to Israel, we would have been grateful. If he had sent an angel, as he did to Mary at the Annunciation, we would have counted it a great privilege. Yet in either case he would have sent us a third party, since men and angels are creatures of his making. But in sending his own Son, eternally begotten by his own being, he was not sending a creature, a third party, but giving himself. As Scott further points out, love is in its essence self-giving. God, in the giving of himself in the Son, doesn't come to planet Earth as a fully grown human, nor is he born into a powerful family with all the protection from difficulty and pain that might be guaranteed through such relationship. He instead is found within a young betrothed girl's womb as nothing more than a spirit-impregnated human egg. The second person of the Trinity was conceived and born needing the care of a mother. To be human is to be vulnerable, but to be a baby is to be vulnerable in a manner we spent a lifetime denying. Indeed, Jesus was a baby refusing to forgo the vulnerability that would climax in his crucifixion, and as such Jesus was entrusted to the care of Mary and Joseph. This is what Stanley Howard says. So Jesus' vulnerability continues very obviously in Matthew's birth narrative. Firstly, even before he was born, there is a very real possibility that his adoptive father will abandon him and his mother. In acceptance of an angelic message received in a dream, thankfully Joseph agrees to take on the responsibility of looking after Mary and the child she is bearing. Of course, the vulnerability continues as a paranoid King Herod becomes aware of this potential threat to his throne through the visiting Magi. Again, with the help of another dream, Joseph has to pack up his wife and child and flee by night to Egypt. Whilst there is much evidence of God's providence towards this child and his family through the timely dream, still there is no angelic host sent from heaven to protect this child from the soldiers of Herod, and the family have to face the vulnerability and uncertainty of being refugees in an unfamiliar country. As Martinez explains, along with his family, Jesus was an exile himself. At the instigation of yet another dream, Joseph returns with his family to Judea, but even on his return, the vulnerability of the child and its family is further exposed through fear of Herod's son Archelaus. The family are then forced to live amongst the hillbillies of Nazareth. Whilst Nazareth no doubt provides a safe place for Jesus to grow up in, it certainly opens him up to further ridicule and misunderstanding as he seeks to bring the message of the kingdom when he steps out at age 30. The early church was also known for its vulnerability, as Paul expresses in the description of its members in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26 to 29. But not only does Paul highlight the foolishness and weakness of many of those called to be a part of the church by Christ, but he continues to highlight his own weakness as a reminder to the church of its calling, as well as an example to them of his own imitation of Christ. Bonhoeffer writes that when the church does come under fire from external forces, the followers of Jesus who experience injustice do not cling to their own rights as if they were possessions to be defended at all costs. Instead, they are completely free of such possessions and are bound to Jesus Christ alone. And whilst we do not resist the leading of God's Spirit and the providence and protection that this might bring, whether it comes through dreams, visions, prophetic utterance, miraculous intervention, or the like, nonetheless, we don't seek to protect ourselves using the means on offer in our society. I would further argue that there is a need to identify with, even at times living with, the marginalised, the poor, the weak, the lonely, the refugee, and any others within our society who suffer exclusion or injustice. How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? Shane Claiborne asks. Whilst Jürgen Moltmann claims that such identification with the poor is a consequence of our identification with the crucified Jesus, I would suggest that such identification also flows from the church's identification with the incarnate Jesus from inception through his death. The vulnerability and powerlessness that Moltmann writes with such poignancy about in his book, The Crucified God, evidences itself even in the birth narratives of Matthew's Gospel. Of course, this shouldn't surprise us, as the crucified Messiah is not a different Jesus to the newborn Jesus. John Macquarie further adds that in the communion of saints, with the heritage found in the self-giving love of the martyrs, which was in turn learned from Christ, the church ipso facto commits itself to a future in which it must lose itself in order to transcend itself and become the kingdom of God. We have not been called and set apart for ourselves. Surely if the church is to imitate the Apostle Paul as he imitates Christ, then it will be willing to lose all things, including its reputation, because of the surpassing value of knowing Jesus Christ, my Lord. Because the church understands that living in Christ and dying is gain, So living is Christ and dying is gain, as Philippians 1:21 tells us. It will not be willing to prop up its earthly existence with the false idols that are offered by society, and even in the name of God by televangelists. Sadly, all too often the church has found itself rich, powerful, and politically influential. As A. Lewis states, how perversely have God's people failed to share and mirror God's own self-giving to and for the world. Instead of confirming our transcendence as a community of renovated minds in cruciform oneness with the least and broken of the world, we have rather been confirmed to the world, blessing and mirroring its mighty and triumphal status. There are those like Jim Wallace who argue that the wealth of the Western Church is clear evidence of idolatry and questions how a church that is wealthy can give testimony to dependence on God. Others, such as Bob Ekblad, also point out that when Christians identify with mainstream culture, its political aspirations, its materialism and individualism, they quickly lose their ability to relate or empathize with the poor, the weak, and the dispossessed. Bob Ekblad writes, one of the greatest barriers between mainstream Christians and people on the margins is that mainstream Christians often represent the dominant culture and do little to nothing to distinguish themselves from it. This inability to relate to the poor and weak in our own societies must raise questions regarding our ability to relate to the poor, weak baby we read of in Matthew. Whilst I have admiration for much of Hans Kung's theology, we can see this sort of disconnect between his life and his ecclesiology that churches in the West are often faced with. He has, as is expected, accepted the privileges offered him by virtue of ordination and then later tenure as a university professor. On one hand, he will rightly explain Jesus expects his disciples voluntarily to renounce rights without compensation. In the wholly concrete situation, for the sake of the other person, the possibility of renouncing one's rights will be offered as an opportunity, says Kung. And yet when his own position was challenged along with his right to teach as a Catholic theologian, something Kung describes as an action against my person as a professor of theology and a Christian who is to be made a non-person in the church and in public, Kung makes use of the media, student protests, and his legal rights to continue holding his position. Kung's popularity is something often touted by himself as evidence of his willingness to proclaim truth, and something that helps him to keep going. I can't but wonder if Kung was really being true to his own ecclesiological convictions to follow Jesus and to live in a way consistent with the theology that he teaches. And there might be a greater willingness on his part to lose all, including allow himself to become a non-person for the sake of his convictions and to embrace the humiliation that is a part of the Christian lot. Why to look to the media and to popular support of others to maintain a sense of well-being? Wouldn't it be better to trust the God whose presence is found in a hated baby rejected by religious leaders and state politicians? And of course, it is not just Kung who needs to ask such questions. John Howard Yoder, whose theology I find particularly engaging and challenging, is another whose predatory behaviour toward women yet again shows the evident disconnect between a person's lived life and their words. So many of our denominations and independent churches desire to be meaningful members of society, receiving the benefits of state support and aid, but struggle with the sort of society they find themselves a part of. Even at times allowing themselves to be locked in some sort of titanic struggle to attempt to reshape society and its political realm into the image of something in which they might be able to continue to feel at home. Bonhoeffer, unlike Kung, was willing to lose his place in the religious system as well as society in his following of Jesus. Ultimately, of course, it would also cost him his life. Bonhoeffer's theology is thereby not simply mediated through his theological writings, but is also mediated through the story of his life and death. Somehow, like Bonhoeffer, and of course like Jesus, the church must evidence its theology, not just through its teaching, but also in how it lives its life in the world.